You don't go by Nathan, right?
Not
That's
Nathaniel.
not your name.
Nathaniel through and through. Yep.
Okay. Is
Yo,
Nathan short for
David,
Nathaniel?
Yep.
can you turn it down a
That's
little
okay.
bit? Or
My
step
my
away?
better?
You're coming hot.
Coming in hot. Is this
Yeah.
better?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. Shall we get started?
Do it.
All right. Nathaniel Whitmore. Was that hot? Did that just blow out? No? That sounded good? Okay. Again, starting over. Nathaniel Whitmore of The Breakdown. Welcome to POV Crypto. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
Nathaniel, I am a huge fan of all the content that you put out, especially lately in this time of uncertainty and crisis. You have really upped your game with content production, getting guests, getting perspective, and discovering the new narratives that have come out. And so I want to do a tip of the hat for just you stepping up and doing what you're doing with The Breakdown. I think it's a really valuable resource of information gathering and perspective gaining in this space.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Like I would think we're going to talk about this, but for me, the entire crypto space is like a gateway drug for people to think about systems of power and just how the world is structured and organized and what agency they have or not to change those things. And so in moments like this, when everything is up for grabs to some extent for this small little window, I think it's a particularly important moment to recontextualize everything that we're doing, in that new context, in that new light. So I've been trying to bring guests who have a lot of different takes on the world, or even people who are just exposed to different takes on the world. So I appreciate that it's resonating.
So you come off, a skill that you have is coming off as extremely neutral. And I think that's really important in your role because you are, to me, The Breakdown is a platform, it's a neutral platform for others to come and share their perspectives, which is difficult in this space, especially when you step into a podcast that is pitches themselves as a Bitcoin versus Ethereum podcast. Has this been difficult to you? How do you view your neutrality and your content production?
Hey, for me, the neutrality is based on the fact that I'm interested in almost everything, right? Like on a base level, and very willing, I think, to learn new things, to be proven wrong. Like my mental model for organizing the world has always been to be like extraordinarily confident about what I know based on the inputs that I have, but also be hungry to look for new inputs that could change that. And that's, for whatever reason, that's just how I've always been. And so with the crypto industry, I mean, in some ways, like for me, it's my interests tend to be more in the, like I said, the big kind of global systems changing type stuff. So things that relate to that are going to get me more naturally interested than other projects that are, there's a ton of projects that are cool, quirky, different, could be really disruptive to a particular industry that I think are neat and really rad. And for people who are invested in that, like are super cool, but it's just not exactly where I am. But because of that, like if I'm going to give those projects a highlight or that perspective a highlight, it doesn't necessarily undermine or impact my perspective on things. I would actually say that the hardest thing about neutrality, and this is not a crypto specific thing, is that if you are trying to build audience, neutrality is the enemy of attention in a lot of contexts, right? Like you have to work really hard to go find that audience of people who are interested in multiple perspectives. I mean, you guys know this because you're trying to create something that is, it's not a neutral isn't the right word for what you do, but is purposefully perspective clashing, right? And I think like if you look at the incentive structure on just Twitter, to take a small sample, like screaming and being the best at pushing like the most popular narratives for whatever tribe you're in. And again, this is not just a crypto specific thing. It's just the way that the algorithms reward it. So I think in some ways the neutrality is a lot harder in terms of like rational audience building and business decision making than it is in terms of like being a person interested in a bunch of things.
So outside of like the fact that crypto is really kind of a space for polymaths and people that like the macro picture, like what about crypto drew you in, and why are you staying in crypto? Like there's so many things in directions that you could go post Corona. Like why crypto?
So I think that there's kind of two parts of that question. One is what got me here, and then two is what the world looks like after and why it's interesting to use this as the lens through which you engage. The got me here question is it's interesting. So I spent about a decade in Silicon Valley, and I was around when Bitcoin was getting popular or starting to get known out there. Like I actually advised a company that went through YC, the same class as Coinbase. I started subscribing to CoinDesk super early, like 2014 or whenever they first started doing their newsletters. But it was so much the payments narrative then, right? It was the same time that Square was starting and all these things. And it was just like unfathomably boring, right? I mean, we even made videos. I had a company that taught big brands what tech to work with. And we did videos for Coca-Cola about Bitcoin and blockchain. And it was so slanted through this might be another way to pay for things on the internet lens, rather than any of the economics of the system, right? Like any of that side. Now, this is 100% like my own fault for not digging deeper, right? This was an unexamined interaction. There were people out there who were already on that tip, right? Who knew and were focused on that side of things. It just wasn't the dominant narrative in traditional VC circles. So it actually took leaving San Francisco, which I did in 2017. We moved to the Hudson Valley to be closer to family and to just kind of like switch the game from city in the weeks, rural on the weekends, to rural on the weeks and city when we need to. And my original background, what got me out to San Francisco was I was one of the early people who started change.org. I came out to help them build out a media network to build their first couple million users. And so my background was all in social impact, social change. And once I got away, I actually had context to come back and look at Bitcoin as a system for that was more akin to some of those global change systems, those things that I had been interested in previously, than kind of like the tech world that I had been brought into or kind of sucked down the hole of for 10 years. So that's kind of what pulled me in, is recontextualizing it in terms of these power systems. Now, in terms of where we're going forward and why stay in crypto, I think that we are about to have a mass scale shift in the way that power is organized and distributed in the world, right? We're going to have a pretty fundamental dislocation of the world that all of us have grown up in. And it's going to be happening so frequently and in so many ways, it won't necessarily always be apparent. At some point, we'll just wake up and then the normal will be new. I mean, think about the Overton window on American manufacturing and American supply chains from, now to 3 months ago. You have across the aisles, right? Like whatever political persuasion, people being like, you know what, actually we probably should be able to, and in fact, doing a lot more domestic manufacturing. We should have the capacity to quickly ramp up things like PPE, to not have our medicine be produced entirely in China. Like these things actually just seem logical now that we've dealt with this. And the fact that that's not the specifics will of course become again a political football, because everything does. But the fact that that has shifted so quickly is, I think, reflective of what a larger set of changes we're going to see. And in that context, I think crypto creates this lens for examining everything in terms of, self-sovereignty, in terms of, there's going to be a lot of power accumulated by a lot of people, basically, and by big institutions. And I think crypto is an escape valve from that in some ways, at least ideally. So I think that the story is just being written. And I feel like the fact that there is an opt-out, even if only a partial and nascent and very incomplete and kind of unwieldy opt-out for a lot of the new power systems that are going to be designed in the next 10 years is a pretty important thing.
Sounds very much along the lines of the sovereign individual thesis.
I think that it's going to be weird times, right? Like we're seeing at once two completely like opposite trends, right? On the one hand, you have this mass scale, like the economy has become a ward of the state effectively at this point, right? Like there was, in 2008, we had this first kind of massive bailout that said that these institutions were too big to fail, right? That was kind of the catchphrase for that. You now have every industry in the world with its hand out in America. And you can debate the specifics of what's right, what's wrong, what should be allowed to fail or what not. Like it's actually like, to give credit where credit is due, this is an enormously difficult set of questions, right? That do have a huge number of factors. Now, it's easier to just kind of be angry at everyone for having no resiliency in the economy. But like when everyone was bad at doing it, it's probably a problem of the superstructure more than any one individual company. So let's hold aside even the easiest and probably deserved pitchforks. It still is a really, really tough problem. But so you have on the one hand, like the nanny, not even the nanny state, but just the state becoming or companies becoming a vassal, markets becoming a vassal of the economy or of the government. Then on the other hand, you have people, you have a totally shifted window on individual bailouts for people, right? And I think that you're going to start to have serious conversations about things like UBI in a way that would have been, again, unthinkable 3 or 4 years ago. So all of these things, on the one hand, could create more and more of an assumption that, well, government's just going to take care of everything for us, right? From individual to institutional levels. But the flip side is that you're also seeing in this, the most resilience, I think, is in these networks of citizens and communities who are coming together to solve problems because they can't wait, literally, right? And this comes from, I'll give you a big example to a small example, a bigger example, I guess. Ben Hunt, who was on the show a couple times over the last month, organized this network, basically a peer-to-peer network. He didn't call it P2P because he's not that down the crypto rabbit hole, but it's a P2P network for buying medical supplies off the open markets that are just available to retail, like to retail people in China. And so this is different, right? These aren't the stockpiles that are sitting there that states are negotiating with and having the price jacked up on. These are just things that are in stores. So they're having people who are on the ground in China. It started with employees of Intel China going out and buying it, shipping it back to the US. They reimburse them, and then they distribute it on a 50, 100, 200 at a time kind of level to different department doctors who need it. So this is all a highly peer-to-peer type of effort, right? They spun up an organization just to facilitate the flow of funds called Frontline Heroes really fast. But so you're seeing things like that. And you know, on the show, what I called that was exceptional but not unique, because you're seeing lots of things like that, right? But then you have, even on a small scale, like I live in a very rural town of probably like 500 actual people live in the town, and then another couple hundred live around the edges. And it's predominantly older. I mean, the average income here is, minuscule, basically, right? Like this is a place that has one main street, like 2 stoplights that end on either side of that main street. Every business has had to shut down. They're all trying to do their part. Like this is not a place where people are kind of like grumbling and getting out of it. You know, again, it's a lot of older people, so they're taking it really, really seriously. There's a lot of fear. The restaurants that have stayed open are all organizing free meals for families without question for anyone who needs it, even though their revenues are going to be down massively, right? And so you have all of this sort of community level resilience, family level resilience, network level resilience that's happening at the same time. And so for me, this becomes in part a narrative challenge of, which story are you going to tell going forward? Was this the moment that America became kind of, again, everyone just became a ward of the state? Or is this the moment where we rediscovered these networks of resilience that allowed us to redesign in a fundamental way? And, you know, my feeling about narratives is that they're completely self-fulfilling prophecy. It's all marketing, right? It's not a historical, objective look at what is actually going on. It is a specific intentional decision to try to tell a story that makes the future so. So for me right now, telling that narrative of ground up resilience is so important and so relevant.
I think the dichotomy of ground up resilience versus the top down nanny state is a through line for this entire crisis. Like we are looking for our UBI checks. Small businesses are looking for their business loans, and then everyone else is looking for a full bailout. Meanwhile, we have actual communities coming together and recreating a bottom up economy. And like people like what you said with Ben Hunt, like that's fostering a bottom-up system, which is supposedly an organic economy. And in the nature of, in the conversation of bottom-up systems, I kind of want to turn to what the main meat of this episode is, which is Bitcoin as a vehicle for truth. Bitcoin is this bottom-up system that is a revolution in the way that money works and is understood. And on the breakdown, you frequently have labeled Bitcoin as a lens for viewing the world. And so I want to get your take on what you mean as Bitcoin as a lens for viewing the world.
So I think Bitcoin challenges a lot of assumptions about things. I mean, it's actually unbelievable. There's memes have resonance when they hit, and the red pill idea, I think, is really palpable, right? That I mean, at one, everyone has seen that movie, so they have a sense of what that means, right? And it's so perfectly visualized and was there. But I think that the synapses that it triggers in people and like cascades for them to think differently about the world is so huge. And I think that that's what's really interesting. So you have the obvious ones, right? I mean, the most obvious narrative for Bitcoin that has emerged from this is like very clearly the anti-correlation narrative was swept out, although it's much more complex, I think, than people give it credit for, obviously. But what happened almost immediately is that the money printer go burr, right? And the contrast of the halving happening at the same time that the federal stimulus machine is going is such a profound and clear and obvious parallel. I mean, someone actually today, I retweeted someone who's like a FinTwit person, who, by the way, I don't think is a particularly big fan of Bitcoin or crypto from what I've seen of them before. And it was on the basis of an essay from William Bernstein about why this type of crisis is likely to exacerbate wealth inequality, which basically has to do with the fact that everyone has to panic sell because we've implicated everyone in the stock market system. Everyone's future is destined about that, especially retirees. They panic sell and they don't have the privilege of buying back in, like just a little bit above where, like, they are the ones who get kind of screwed in this situation because of just the dry powder available to them. And so I retweeted this, and someone was like, "Oh, this is so frustrating that like crypto Twitter is just turning into FinTwit with a libertarian bent, rather than talking about like new things and new adoption." And I was like, well, listen, there's a lot to debate about this. One, when you have like a singularity type event here that is going to recontextualize everything, like everything becomes about that for a minute. Entertainment is about that for a minute. So there's that. But second, and actually kind of, I think, more importantly for what we're saying, is that part of the reason that we're sharing more stuff from FinTwit is that FinTwit is looking a lot more like crypto Twitter right now. It's looking a lot more like Bitcoin Twitter right now, because the scale of this shift in terms of what we thought was economic orthodoxy is so head spinning that all of a sudden they're sound like us, like and I think that there's again, this is exemplary of this idea of the reason that it's less surprising to this community is that this community has thought through these implications, has game theoried out this kind of scenarios in their head. And so it's surprising perhaps for the sheer scale and speed with which it happened, but is not surprising on some core level either, So there's that whole piece too. But I think that the idea of as a lens, I think, goes a lot farther even than just the properties of Bitcoin, because once you start to like reject the easy arguments, so like, for example, like the kind of Sanders populism versus Trump populism, once you reject the easy dogmas of those things, you start to have like this huge space for conversation. Like I had a very extensive conversation when Elizabeth Warren was still in the race about wealth inequality and what I thought it was, and Cantillon effects and all these sort of things. And it's like, that shit is really complicated. Like, it's not like most people have not had the context to think about why cheap money would lead to asset price appreciation, would lead to the rich getting richer. Like these structural systemic decisions, these aren't like morality decisions of one kind of political party or another, although like at any given moment in history, there's one party who's pushing for one thing more than another. But like those things are actually really mind-opening for people. And it doesn't require them like signing on and getting getting their first coins even to do that. It's just starting to think about this thing as an alternative. So that's kind of what I mean. I think when I say it's a lens of seeing the world, it creates a context to question things in a different way.
In the past, I've tweeted that Bitcoin's kind of like a psychedelic because it opens your eyes to a whole new world, or something that you've never seen money, you've never seen energy, you've never seen all these things until you've seen it through the Bitcoin light. I'm kind of curious, like for you, like how does Bitcoin as this kind of like complete juxtaposition from what the Fed is doing right now, like how does that start creeping into the mainstream conversation more? Like we already see it with Robert Kiyosaki and all these people kind of like from the hedge fund world and the personal finance world starting to talk about Bitcoin. But like what does it take to make this thing seem like it's the answer for a lot of the issues that Main Street is having, right? I don't think it's come to Main Street in a real way yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the level is we're still at the level of individual missionaries who get their communities to take this more seriously and think differently about it, right? Like, I think that it's actually really important that we don't overstate. Like, we get sucked into narrative traps where we get like stuck in our own memes to some extent. And like right now, like the pizza shop in my town, buying Bitcoin is not going to help them in their short-term concerns, right? Now, I think that you could argue about like shifting from a credit culture to a savings culture and how that has implications for everyone and blah, 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 blah. And like those arguments are all good. They're important. They're like large scale, societal change level stuff. But we have to acknowledge in this type of moment, the different orders of need, different hierarchies of need. But in that context, who's really effective right now is people that other people trust, right? Like right now, trust in the traditional bearers of information, in the traditional bearers of leadership is, I mean, there will be theses written forever about how this was the straw that broke the camel's back on institutional trust, media trust, basically trust in all ways. And this has been happening forever. This is not a new phenomenon, but holy shit, did this just accelerate it, right? And so what you're left with is you're forced effectively to curate the people who you more or less think are telling it to you straight. And so those are the people that people need to hear from to like, there's no longer a mainstream. There's just a huge number of small streams that all feed in together and sometimes clash into each other. And so it's kind of a messy process of converting as many of those little streams as we can until it just becomes kind of a flood.
If you have a question, you should ask it. Otherwise, I'm going to skip to a different subject.
Let's go for it.
Okay, cool. All right. So one of the questions that you asked is why is crypto Twitter so fascinated with coronavirus? You identified early on that the people that are into crypto are oddly into coronavirus. Most importantly and most notably, like Balaji and Ryan Selkis, and then it spread out really fast. Like those guys kind of started the engine churning with why the crypto Twitter is fascinated more so than the typical population. And you could definitely say that like, well, Twitter would be the place where like the existence of coronavirus would show up first. But I think that crypto Twitter specifically in juxtaposition to the rest of Twitter picked up on coronavirus, partly because we understand viral systems, because Bitcoin and crypto economic systems are viral systems at large. And so the structure that makes a virus run are similar structures to how crypto runs. And so I'm wondering if that is the conclusion that you came to, or if not, what did you come to with why crypto Twitter likes to pay attention to coronavirus?
I think this is a both and type of moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of thought that then, but I especially think that now. Like, I think one thing that's become clear is that this was not unique to us. We were just early, right? Like every Twitter is coronavirus Twitter right now, including entertainment Twitter, including gaming Twitter. It's all coronavirus Twitter. There's just no escaping
It's
that.
coronavirus world.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. I think that there's a bunch of different reasons. I think understanding exponential systems is certainly a thing. That was something that people said a lot. But if I'm being really honest, I think that the biggest reason is that we pay a lot of attention to China and Asia. This is the first industry in history, first technology at least, that has grown up simultaneously all around the world at the same time. And it's, arguable, and I think pretty compellingly arguable, that actually, in fact, the USA is not the most important, or at least is not the only important pole of this place, right? Asia and China in particular are hugely, hugely significant in terms of the development of crypto. So when we saw, well, one, there's a lot of people that we know who are actually working there, right? And when we see them getting quarantined and locked down, and then just more broadly, when we see the entire supply chain capital of the world having somewhere between tens and hundreds of millions of people in quarantine, while markets, on the other hand, are printing new all-time highs, the disparity of that information is so brain fragging that all you need, from there, it's just a matter of whether you think that viruses are going to travel around the world. And this is the thing that has driven me nuts. Again, as someone who got my start out of college in the social impact world, pandemics were one of the top things we were talking about in 2002, 2003, 2004. This was absolutely an inevitability, right? A fucking inevitability of the modern world. And so the idea that once it was there, that it wouldn't somehow go everywhere in the same way was just ludicrous, right? So I think you have all of these combination of ingredients that were ready to just be there. And then again, you had a couple of key missionaries. Balaji is really interesting because, he's not just a crypto person. He actually comes from this sort of background. So this is was particularly triggering to him. Selkis, I think, has a really acute instinct when information that is important to people is not being shared, right? And I think this was reinforced for him when he was the first one to basically leak the memo about Gox, right, in 2014. So I think that those missionaries were really important to also to getting people kind of on board and talking about this earlier.
I definitely felt like being a part of Bitcoin Twitter and crypto Twitter that I was significantly more prepared. Early February, I was sending my mom mask links on Amazon. I was like, I'm buying these.
Yeah.
I think you guys should buy them too. Stuff like that. Got the toilet paper before the rush, all that stuff. So the Bitcoiners and the crypto community was definitely ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I do think that one of the most interesting things, one kind of bright spot for people in this community is that I literally don't know that there was any community that you could have been part of where the average knowledge was higher in late January and through February of this. Including the medical community, because the medical community is so based on a hierarchy of expertise and credentialing. It's not that pound for pound, I'm sure that doctors are going to give any industry and for average intelligence is just raw brain power, but when your entire world has been you trust these institutions, these traditional institutions of power, you don't think to disobey that,
So
actually, I was going to add something. Actually, so this brings me to something that you tweeted that I thought was super, super interesting and repeated it on the show a couple of times, is that you made the astute observation that this was one of the first global catastrophes or events that are happening where everyone just kind of assumed that the official word was either false by being malicious or just because incompetence. Either they couldn't get the right number or they're faking the right number, trying to change it. So I mean, obviously it started in China, but even coming into the U.S. now, and the WHO and all these international organizations, no one really knows what to believe, and this is really kind of unprecedented.
It is unprecedented. I mean, that's why I kind of think this is like a straw that breaks the camel's back type of moment, in the sense that none of these things were new, but they're so dramatic, on such display, and had such immediate consequences. It's very rare that the consequences of institutionally bad decision making get felt close enough to the locus of that decision that there's actually a chance for citizen uproar, right? I mean, take for example 2008. Occupy Wall Street didn't start in like November 2008. Like it took a long time. It took books coming out and being written, because these are big like systemic superstructure things. And like really, I would say that we didn't see the true impact of 2008 until 3 weeks ago, when everyone showed up expecting a handout. Like that's the real fallout of that moment. It took 12 years basically to really see those chickens come home to roost. Now, obviously that's holding aside everything we were just talking about in terms of wealth inequality and percentage of stock and all that stuff that was like the also happening. But yeah, I think that when it comes to trust in information and trusted information providers, this is a really rough moment. This is a really, really rough moment. Yeah, so I mean, we could go deep on that.
So Christian here talks about how Bitcoin is a conversation about money. And I think we all, in going down this crypto rabbit hole, you go down the what is money rabbit hole, and then you learn that money is something different. And then alongside this rabbit hole is this idea that money is at the bottom of society, right? Like human values and our labor and our sweat gets instantiated in money. And then money is this thing that we share to host an economy. And Bitcoin as this new money system, this very rigid and very strict money system. And then this is what we were talking about with Nick Carter earlier, is that money has values in it, and it's something that you can grab onto. Bitcoin is something that you can grab onto and use as a point of perspective for viewing other things. And so when you say that like a fintech Twitter is like crypto Twitter because it's viewing the government and their actions through a lens that is like a Bitcoiner lens. And so the Bitcoiner crypto Twitter got it right in this idea where like, okay, now that the time has come and money printer go burr, Bitcoiners, there seems to be a lot more people who talk like Bitcoiners from that perspective. And then we were also talking about how crypto Twitter got onto coronavirus earlier than everyone else. And so Bitcoin offers this anchor to latch onto and to view our old money system from a different perspective. And we are able to gain new insights and new realities from that perspective. And it also throws into question authority at the same time, because it goes right to the heart of what is true about the world. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts about like Bitcoin. And then what we titled this episode is Bitcoin as a vehicle for truth. Bitcoin is a way to find truth in the world. Is that how you see Bitcoin? Do you see Bitcoin as this thing that produces truth?
Well, I think it's let's take this from two different perspectives, because I think one is more general and one is specific to this moment in this time that we find her in now. So let's start with the moment in time first. So Chamath was on Pomp's podcast on Saturday, and his main thesis is that we're going to have to totally redesign the economy from something that was designed for efficiency to something that was designed for resilience, right? Like this is, I mean, fundamentally what we have seen, what has been clearly shown is that this was an extraordinarily efficient, but an extraordinarily unresilient, an extraordinarily fragile system in so many dimensions, right? In terms of cash on hand for businesses, in terms of the way that supply chains were organized, right? And it's important. What I loved about that spectrum, right, showing these two things as two sides of a pole, is that if things are always good, there's a reason that the stock market is at all-time highs, right? Like the design for efficiency has created an extraordinary amount of wealth. It's just, for whom and how real is it and how susceptible to disruption is it, right? And we haven't asked ourselves which trade-offs we're willing to make for more resilience in a very long time. Moreover, individuals haven't been asked to make those trade-offs or think about those trade-offs, right? We live in a consumer society where our economy is predicated, the way that it has been designed is predicated on us spending more and more and more, right? Like post September 11th, we got like our stimulus check was like $400 or whatever, right? Like it was $600 in the mail. Like it was like go spend more, because that was the nature of the economy. And now I don't think it's as radical as a wholesale shift from one to another. But I do think that you're going to see, well, one, you're going to see the government start to mandate resilience and build in resilience because they're going to force people to. And second, you're going to see, I think, a lot of people who are having a very different conversation with themselves and their families about resilience. Now, this is even having that conversation is a privilege relative to where a lot of people are going to be coming out of this, right? Like, it's kind of easy to talk about resilience if you're not worried about losing, going from 50 hours to 18 hours a week at your job as the woman in my town I was just talking to, right? Like, resilience, even having that conversation is a privilege. So there's that. But I do think that, like, for those who are in a position to think about and have options on how they design their life, you're going to see some different decisions. Now, in that context, Bitcoin it's perfectly designed for this, right? It is a system that is like, it redefines resilient. Like Preston Pish the other day around the difficulty adjustment, he tweeted out something like, Bitcoin, the system is so resilient, it's almost laughable. And I think it is. And like, the more that you get into it, the more different dimensions you see of that, like difficulty adjustment and things like that. But Bitcoin it happens to be, I think, one of the non-bullshit memes of right now is that it was designed for this moment. Now, I think that it would be oversimplistic to think that that's just because we're expecting some hyperinflationary period. I think it's much more about the fact that there's going to be a large scale restructuring of economies and maybe parts of society to try to be more resilient. And in that context, Bitcoin fits as an asset and as a mental model, as a framework. So that's the kind of the part of the answer to the question that has to do with the specifics of where we live in now. Now, as a truth-seeking system, kind of the more metaphorical, like, would be relevant in any time. What we were just talking about is this trust in media, trust in leaders, trust in traditional sources. So in this context, obviously, this trust don't verify thing, right? The fact that this solves the trust problem with openness, with available information, right, is a pretty spectacular kind of mental model, right? Where it's funny, like, I was having this conversation with Dimitri Kofinas today from Hidden Forces, and he was talking about how in the circles that he was, like, on Twitter and everything, it was really not allowed to talk about like how we get the economy back online, and in what context might there be more harm from economic damage than virus damage. And I was reflecting that, like, although it is so contentious, like, again, the Overton window on what people get to talk about on Bitcoin Twitter and crypto Twitter, if they're willing to wade through it, is way bigger than most spaces, right? Like, there really is a vast terrain of opinions one can occupy. Now, again,
Hashtag toxic.
People are going to come out in force if they don't like what you say, but at least, like, that's different than it's weirdly, it doesn't have a cancel culture. Like, not to, like, try to reappropriate that. It would much rather fucking yell at you, like, forever than cancel you, I think. Like, maybe I'm being optimistic, but again, like I told you guys, I'm in the business of narrative. So I'm going to tell the story that I think is the one that I want to see and try to project and make it so.
It's much less agreeable, that's for sure. And, like, people that come there are okay with that.
Yeah. I also think, although I will say that people dramatically underestimate how, like, productive disagreements where you're willing to, like, walk down the path with someone are. Like, if you don't start from a premise of, like, you're stupid and you don't get this. Like, I've had actually a lot of success with people where I thought they were being, really, like, contentious or overly contentious or dismissive of people, like, actually, like, digging in. Now, of course, it's not always going to work. I think that there are certain personalities, and, like, I don't think that, again, the algorithms really reward people, like, kind of virtual, like, handshake and agree to disagree. Like, that's not what makes for good optics. It's much better to pick battles. But I think that people, I think that there's a lot more room for civil disagreement than people think too.
Sorry, my audio is cutting in and out here.
That's what POV crypto's for, by the way, is hashing it out.
Yeah, I love it. No, I love that was one of the ideas so basically the part of the instinct for the breakdown, or what it was originally Crypto Daily 303, was just like, I mean, every industry in the world, every business in the world, like, has daily news analysis. Like, it's just a thing that happens, and no one was doing it. So I was like, screw it, I'm going to do it, like, and then it kind of, it kind of morphed. But as I was thinking about this, I knew I wanted to do something podcasty or with video. And this idea of trying to create a debate space was something that I was really interested in. But I think you guys have a much better approach to it than I would have done.
It's nice because me and Christian went to college together, so we have that background to be able to slap each other around with.
Yeah, I think that's really important, actually. Like, that rapport goes a really long way.
So what's next for the breakdown? Like, what's the next 6 months looks like?
I mean, one is just continuing to expand the perspectives that come on here. I mean, one thing that's been actually really awesome for me is I have found people have responded better to having voices that are outside of crypto but coming in way more than I would have thought. I kind of was just like, I can't not do this right now, because there's also like, I have to try to go understand this. And I'm going to look at, like, again, I've always been kind of like a big systems picture, type person. And so, but people have been really responding to that. So that's really great. So it kind of feels like it gives me license to go get more different people. And honestly, like, this show is really helpful for me, guys. I appreciate it, because like this, I do want people to have this idea that, like, what they're going to get, they are going to get some of that, like, news analysis or whatever, if there's really significant events in crypto. But a lot of times it's going to be like these larger scale kind of questions. But also, like, the fun thing about doing the daily is that you don't have to try to create like evergreen content that people are going to come back to over and over and over again. That's not exactly the value proposition. Now, some of them will end up being that. Like, Preston is so good on the show, Preston Pish, that I think that people will go back and listen to that episode a lot, right? I think Peter Zayon, just anything that he does right now, people are going to go back and listen to, because he's talking about such significant things that are different than the ideas most people have. But a lot of times, like, what you'll start to see is guests who've been on there 2-3 times, because it's like there's a new set of things that day, that week to talk about, right? And so continuing to build out and expand that is really important to me, and experimenting with different formats. Like, one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is I think it's insane. The, like, money and economies are like pretty much the most significant forces, more or less, the defining forces in everyone's lives. But if you look at the average, like, across financial media, like, it's basically all us. It's all like college educated, like, like upper class, upper middle class folks, like, who come from that perspective. And even those folks who aren't from that perspective, like, fought in to get there, versus like having like a really interesting, different conversation that, like, I really am very interested in finding either people who have come to Bitcoin, but from a radically different perspective, and doing, like, I don't know, mini series, or like, bingeable series with them, or something like that. That's like a really different, like, kind of content unit, or going and finding people who haven't, and figuring out, like, what it looks like to expose them and let them find their way down the rabbit hole. So I don't know. I'm kind of like, I can't not experiment with content mediums. I'm just kind of this, but by nature. So I'm sure it'll keep evolving, and I'll follow my nose with what seems to work.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I think you're the most prolific content creator. I thought that we were pretty prolific, but I don't think we can stand a chance compared to you. The long read Sundays are just absolutely epic.
Oh my God, those are when it was really sad to move that from Twitter, just because, like, Twitter just absolutely destroys threads now. It just became not worth it, which sucks, because, like, they designed this medium. They've continued to build and push features that make it easier to do that medium, but then the algorithm just absolutely buries it. So that's a real shame. But those things, especially when they were on Twitter, they took a really long time. Like, that was insane.
I mean, honestly, much respect. I want to end with some predictions. If you could, like, if there's like a theme in the short term that you're kind of honing in on, and then a theme in the long term that you think is going to be important now that we've kind of had this pivotal shift.
What dimension? Like large scale economy or Bitcoin, crypto, or both?
I would say just more macro in general.
So I think that you're going to see the acceleration of a lot of trends that were already underway, but I think in pretty dramatic form. I think that when it comes to the crisis, like my biggest frustration now is that like we keep fighting the wrong fight rather than asking the right question, which to me has been for weeks. What does it look like to actually restart the economy? Like, this is the only question that matters because it's a health question and it's an economic question. There's no light switch that we flip on that this just works, right? It involves testing, it involves like dealing with really thorny privacy issues as it relates to tracking individuals. It deals with like having staggered systems of bringing people back, having the capacity to get people to voluntarily stay home for short durations in the future. Like
some industries don't.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's going to be incredibly complex, and
Right.
because we keep having some stupid fight, like the latest stupid fight is why were all the models wrong? It's like, well, the counterfactual of a pandemic where you didn't start to do things like social distancing makes it a very easy thing to be like you don't want the model to have been right? You want to have gotten sufficiently ahead of it that it was wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't question models, that we can't reevaluate our systems, right? Like that's not what I'm saying at all. But so anyways, we're having that stupid fight now instead of, again, like the real important one, which is like, how do we actually get people back to work? So I think that there's going to be a lot of pain in that. It's going to be really bumpy. It's going to like extend this way more out, much longer than it could be. I have no idea what's going to go on with the larger markets. The consensus that I seem to see is like, people are really not convinced by this rally, like even a little bit.
I've been dumping.
Yeah.
I've been like, oh yeah, good opportunity to dump. I've seen this before with Bitcoin.
Yeah, and that seems to be like, well, it's weird because like the smart people that I follow seem to think that, but then a lot of others are just buying in. So I don't know. I'm definitely, that's out of my scope for sure. But I do think that it would surprise me if there wasn't a lot more second order effect pain over the next year. I mean, certainly, like my favorite meme is that dude in the yellow suit who's like creeping by a tree like this or whatever, who's like waiting for something. And so I saw one that's like millennials waiting for house prices to crash so they can actually buy their first home. That is 100% us right now. We are like, ooh, come on, like, okay, boomer, like stock market's down, got to sell your second house, like preferably in Rhinebeck in New York so we can buy it. So yeah, I think I unfortunately, like, I don't want to predict pain. I don't think it's impossible that this insane amount of action actually does like allow this crazy party to go on a little longer either. Like, it wouldn't shock me, like I think that they're willing to go to the ends of the earth, because I'll just say this before I get to the other side of this. Like, one of the event horizons that we've crossed that I don't think people really appreciate is this administration's willingness to do literally whatever it takes to get reelected. And this is like every president wants to get reelected. This is not a unique thing, right? But like, I genuinely don't believe that there is an upper limit on what they will do without any question for long-term implications or precedent as it relates to the economy basically relying on continued prop up from the state. And once that happens, it immediately becomes not a party, right? Can you imagine the political courage it will take to not bail companies out in the future or not bail people out? Like, it's going to be nuts. So again, this is a catalytic force, maybe an event horizon that's crossed, that just based on the virtue of who's in the seat now, but might have been no matter who it was, right? It's not necessarily like, it might have been the exact same with Hillary too, right? So but I think that that's actually a really big issue where, and why it could be so wonky for so much time is that I don't know, like, there will never be nothing else they can try. There will always be something else they can try. And so it's really going to be a weird thing of how much can the US system bear as, as the only economy in the world effectively. So that's kind of like big macro picture, is just a lot of confusion, potentially really different outcomes, and a lot of pain along the way, particularly because we're just not going to have a smart conversation about how to get people back to work. I think one thing that I'm watching that I think is really interesting in Bitcoin and crypto is people fleeing local currencies as they get devalued relative to the dollar into USD denominated stablecoins. So Max Bronstein and Avi Feldman wrote a really great piece about this, crypto dollarization, on their blog. Nick Carter wrote about it, and it is really hard, and it's going to get harder to actually get exposure to actual US dollars for a whole bunch of reasons. Getting exposure through these synthetic, approximations becomes much more interesting, and interesting to parts around the world. Now, we've already seen this type of behavior with stablecoins and Tether in particular, in Russia, China, all these places that, again, have restrictions on how they can move money and why. But I think that you're going to start to see it from Argentinians. I think you're going to see, like anywhere that is dealing with a complicated currency. And by the way, every currency right now is complicated. I haven't looked recently, but a week ago, the Australian dollar had fallen something like 27% against the USD. That's crazy, right? That's crazy how fast that happens. So this is a situation where a crypto asset solves a real pain point, real problem right away. But I think that, we talk about things that end up becoming on-ramps for Bitcoin, right? So the conversation last year around Libra and digital dollars and stuff was like, well, will people get exposed and then maybe they want access to Bitcoin? And like, I bought that a little bit, like with the Libra thing, like maybe some small portion of people would. I buy it way more in the context of citizens, individuals, businesses trying to flee local currency regimes in like a very destabilized economic period. The path from Tether to asset exposure to something like Bitcoin and other things in the space feels much more plausible to me than like, it's all good times and I'm using Libra bucks to shop and maybe I'll go learn about Bitcoin too, So I think that's something that I'm watching. I think the immediate beneficiary is not necessarily Bitcoin. I think like because dollar is the only asset that's holding up in any real way, that's where people are going to want to go. But at some point, people are going to want to buy other things. And I think a lot of them are going to, they're going to have the dry powder sitting there to maybe go over to some different things. So that's kind of something that it's not so much a prediction, but something that I'm certainly watching.
Great. Awesome. Nathaniel, thanks for coming on to POV Crypto. The takes in here are wide reaching and definitely come from a privileged spot of access to information that you have at the breakdown. So for our listeners, I definitely recommend the listen and subscribe to NLW, your Twitter account, and then also does the breakdown have its own podcast, Twitter?
No, not yet. I have a lot of stuff that I got to do to update that. But
so if people want to follow you and the breakdown, what should they do?
At me, or then look for the breakdown or my name, Nathaniel Whittemore, on any of the podcast places. It'll be everywhere, basically.
Christian, you're muted.
Cool. You can find our podcast at POV CryptoPod. Make sure 5-star reviews. Bitcoin is getting close to 10K, but it's not going to get there till we get 100 reviews. So please get us there. We're so close.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathaniel.
Right on, guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. And Christian, it's on you to stop it.